The afternoon sun was blazing through the windows of the gym when the front door opened with a soft creak. Victor barely looked up from the heavy bag he was adjusting. He'd been running this Muay Thai gym in downtown Los Angeles for almost 16 years now, and he could usually tell within seconds what kind of person was walking through that door. Students came in all types. Some were young fighters with dreams of becoming champions. Others were office workers trying to lose weight or learn self-defense. Then there were the tourists who wanted to try something exotic for a week before disappearing forever. Victor had seen them all, and he prided himself on reading people quickly. The man who walked in that Tuesday looked like he belonged in the third category. Maybe late 50s, possibly 60. He wore simple gray sweatpants and a plain black t-shirt that had seen better days. His hair was a bit long, touched with gray, and he had the kind of quiet face that you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him. Nothing about him screamed fighter or even athlete. He looked like someone's uncle who decided to try something new after his doctor told him to get more exercise. "Can I help you?" Victor called out, wiping his hands on a towel. The man walked over with an easy stride, not rushed, not hesitant. "Just calm." "Hi, I'm John," the man said, extending his hand. His grip was firm but not aggressive. "I'm interested in taking some private lessons if you have availability." Victor sized him up while they shook hands. The guy seemed polite enough, almost too polite. There was something gentle about him that immediately made Victor think this wouldn't last. People like this usually quit after 2 sessions when they realized how hard real Muay Thai training actually was. "Private lessons run $150 an hour, Victor said, crossing his arms. "How much experience do you have?" "Some," John replied with a slight smile. "But I'd like to learn your style, your techniques. I've heard good things about this gym." Victor nodded slowly. The answer was vague, which usually meant the person had watched a few YouTube videos and thought they knew something. He'd trained hundreds of students over the years, and the ones who came in acting humble were sometimes the most delusional about their actual skill level. "All right," Victor said. "Let me see what you've got. We'll do an evaluation session first. 30 minutes, $50. If it works out, we can schedule regular sessions." John agreed without hesitation and paid in cash. Victor pointed him toward the changing room and told him they'd start in 10 minutes. As John walked away, Victor shook his head slightly. The guy moved okay for his age, but there was something about him that seemed soft. Too nice, too easygoing. This wasn't the attitude of someone serious about martial arts. When John returned wearing hand wraps and borrowed gloves, Victor led him to the main training area. A few other students were working on the heavy bags nearby, and a couple of guys were doing pad work on the other side of the gym. The sound of fists and shins hitting leather filled the space with that familiar rhythm Victor had heard for nearly 2 decades. "Let's start with your stance," Victor said, positioning himself in front of John. "Show me what you've got." John took a basic fighting stance. Feet shoulder-width apart, hands up, weight balanced. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't impressive either. Victor walked around him, making small adjustments to his position with his hands, pushing his elbow in here, adjusting his hip there. "You're too square," Victor said, his tone already taking on a slightly dismissive edge. "Against any real fighter, you'd get picked apart in seconds." John nodded and adjusted his stance without arguing. Victor noticed this and felt his assumption confirmed. The guy was passive, no fire, no competitive spirit. Just another middle-aged man trying to recapture some youth or impress his friends with stories about training at a real gym. They moved through basic combinations. Jab, cross, hook, then adding in kicks. Low kick, body kick, high kick. John followed instructions well enough. But to Victor's critical eye, everything looked too controlled, too measured. There was no aggression, no power. The guy was holding back, probably afraid of looking stupid or hurting himself. What Victor didn't realize was that John wasn't holding back out of fear. He was being careful because he was studying, watching, learning the space, the rhythm, the way Victor taught. After decades of training with world-class fighters and coordinators, John had learned that the first rule of entering any new training environment was to observe and respect the culture before showing what you could really do. But Victor interpreted the careful approach as weakness. "You need to commit to your strikes," Victor said, demonstrating a powerful roundhouse kick that made the bag swing wildly. "Don't be scared of it. This isn't Tai Chi. This is fighting." A few of the other students glanced over, noticing the tone in their instructor's voice. Victor had always been tough, but there was something different in the way he was addressing this new guy. something almost mocking. John simply nodded again and continued working. He threw the combination Victor had shown him, his kicks landing with solid thuds against the pads. But Victor was already shaking his head before the combination finished. "No, no, no," Victor said. "You're too stiff. Too mechanical. You fight like a robot, loosen up. Where did you train before anyway?" "Here and there," John said quietly. "Different places over the years." "Well, they didn't teach you much," Victor replied. "We're going to have to break down some bad habits." The 30-minute evaluation stretched to 45 minutes. Victor kept finding things to criticize, kept demonstrating techniques with increasing showmanship, clearly trying to impress upon this humble stranger just how much he had to learn. The other students had stopped their own training to watch, sensing something strange in the dynamic. When the session finally ended, both men were sweating. Victor because he'd been showing off, throwing powerful combinations and spinning kicks to display his skill. John because he'd been absorbing everything quietly, never once trying to match Victor's energy or prove himself. "So," Victor asked, stripping off his focus mitts, "think you can handle training here?" "It's not going to be easy. I push my students hard." "I'd like to continue," John said, that same calm smile on his face. "When can we schedule the next session?" Victor almost laughed. The guy had just spent 45 minutes being told he wasn't good enough and he was coming back for more. Either he was incredibly dedicated or incredibly clueless. Victor suspected the latter. "Thursday afternoon work for you?" Victor asked. "Perfect." They scheduled 3 sessions a week for the next month. As John left the gym that evening, Victor turned to one of his longtime students, a guy named Rico who'd been training there for 5 years. "That guy's not going to last 2 weeks, Victor said confidently. Rico wasn't so sure. He'd been watching the new student carefully, and something about the way the man moved didn't match Victor's assessment. There was a precision to his techniques even when he was supposedly doing them wrong. A control that seemed deliberate rather than tentative. "I don't know, man," Rico said. "He seems pretty determined." Victor waved him off. "They all seem determined at first. Wait until the bruises start showing up. Wait until I really push him. These older guys always have something to prove when they walk in here, but reality hits them fast." What Victor didn't know was that reality was about to hit him much harder. The quiet, unassuming man he'd just spent 45 minutes condescending to had endured far more intense training than anything Victor could imagine. John had trained with champions, with stunt coordinators who made their living choreographing realistic fight scenes, with martial artists who dedicated their entire lives to their craft. But more importantly, John had learned something that Victor had apparently forgotten over the years. He'd learned that true skill didn't need to announce itself, that real mastery was quiet and humble, that the most dangerous people in any room were often the ones who seemed the least threatening. As Victor locked up the gym that night, he felt satisfied with himself. Another student signed up, another source of income, another person he could mold and teach. He had no idea that he'd just made one of the biggest mistakes of his professional life. The man he'd dismissed as soft, as weak as someone who would quit within 2 weeks, was about to teach him a lesson in humility that would change everything about the way he approached martial arts, teaching, and life itself. But that lesson was still a few days away. For now, Victor went home confident in his superiority, completely unaware that the universe was preparing to humble him in the most profound way possible. Thursday afternoon came quickly, and John showed up exactly on time. Victor was already working with another student when he walked in, and he barely acknowledged him with a quick nod. John changed quietly and started warming up in the corner by himself, doing stretches and light shadow boxing. Victor watched him out of the corner of his eye while holding pads for a younger fighter named Danny. The older man's movements were still too controlled, too soft in Victor's opinion. There was no fire there, no killer instinct. Victor had been thinking about it since Tuesday, and he'd decided this student needed to be pushed harder, needed to understand what real training felt like. When Victor finished with Danny, he called John over to the center mat. The gym was more crowded today, with about 8 other students scattered around working on various drills. Victor liked having an audience. It motivated his students and reminded everyone who was in charge. "Today we're going to work on conditioning," Victor announced. "Can't build a fighter on technique alone. Need to toughen you up." They started with pad work, but Victor was hitting back harder than necessary during defensive drills. Every time John blocked a strike, Victor would follow through with more force than needed for training. Not enough to be obvious, but enough that John's forearms were starting to show red marks after just 15 minutes. John said nothing. He simply adjusted his defense and continued training. This silence irritated Victor more than any complaint would have. It felt like the man wasn't even affected, wasn't even registering that he was being tested. "Your defense is sloppy," Victor said loudly enough for nearby students to hear. "You block like you're swatting flies." This is why older guys struggle with martial arts. No reflexes anymore. A few students glanced over uncomfortably. They'd never heard Victor talk to a student quite like this. Sure, he was tough and demanding, but there was usually respect underneath it. This felt different. This felt personal, though none of them could understand why. John adjusted his blocking technique without responding. His face remained calm, almost neutral. He wasn't getting angry or defensive. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was just absorbing the criticism and continuing to work. This made Victor even more determined to get a reaction. Over the next week, the pattern continued. 3 times a week, John showed up on time, paid in cash, and endured increasingly harsh treatment. Victor's comments got sharper. During one session, while demonstrating a combination to the whole class, he called John up as an example. "Let me show you all what not to do," Victor said, positioning John in front of everyone. "See how his hips aren't rotating? How his weight distribution is all wrong? This is what happens when you try to learn martial arts from movies instead of real training." The other students shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't normal teaching. This was humiliation. But Victor was the instructor, the authority figure. No one felt comfortable challenging him, especially not on behalf of someone they barely knew. John stood there while Victor critiqued every aspect of his stance and technique in front of the entire class. When Victor finally dismissed him, John simply nodded and went back to his spot on the mat. No arguments, no excuses, no emotion showing on his face at all. Rico, the veteran student who'd had doubts from the beginning, approached John during the water break. "Hey man, you okay?" Rico asked quietly. "Victor's being pretty rough on you." John smiled slightly. "It's fine. I'm here to learn." "Yeah, but he doesn't usually. He's tough on everyone, but this is different. You don't have to take that if you don't want to." "I appreciate your concern," John said genuinely, "but I'm okay. Really." Rico wanted to push further, but something in John's demeanor stopped him. The man wasn't bothered. He wasn't hurt or angry or embarrassed. He seemed completely at peace with the situation, which made no sense to Rico. Anyone else would have either quit by now or confronted Victor. This guy just kept showing up and taking it. By the 3rd week, Victor's behavior had crossed into territory that made several students seriously uncomfortable. During pad work, he accidentally struck John's ribs with an elbow when demonstrating a close-range technique. John grunted from the impact but didn't complain. Victor laughed it off. "Gotta keep your guard tighter than that," Victor said. "In a real fight, that would have broken a rib." John rubbed his side and nodded. "I'll work on it." The next session was even worse. Victor decided they would do some light sparring, which was unusual for a private lesson. He paired John up with Danny, one of the younger, more aggressive fighters in the gym. But before they started, Victor pulled Danny aside. "Don't go easy on him," Victor said quietly. "Old guy needs to learn his limitations." Danny looked uncomfortable but nodded. He was only 23 and looked up to Victor. If the instructor said this was part of the training, then it must be. The sparring session was brutal to watch. Danny came at John with combinations that were way too fast and powerful for what was supposed to be light technical sparring. John defended himself adequately, blocking most of the strikes, but he never countered aggressively. He would tap Danny lightly with return strikes, clearly pulling all his power, while Danny was throwing everything he had. After 3 rounds, John had a split lip and a swelling around his left eye. Danny was barely winded and completely unmarked. Victor called the sparring off with a satisfied look on his face. "That's what real fighting looks like," Victor announced. "This isn't some movie choreography. This is the real deal." John pressed a towel to his lip and thanked Danny for the session. Danny looked guilty, avoiding eye contact. He knew what had happened wasn't right, but he didn't know how to address it without disrespecting Victor. In the changing room afterward, while John was cleaning up his face, Rico approached him again. This time he wasn't alone. 2 other students, both guys who'd been training there for years, were with him. "Man, you need to say something to Victor," Rico said firmly. "What happened out there wasn't training. I don't know what that was, but it wasn't right." "Danny was just following instructions," John said calmly, examining his swollen eye in the mirror. "No hard feelings." "That's not the point," another student named Carlos interjected. "Victor set that up. He's been riding you hard since day 1, and now this. You're paying for private lessons, not to be someone's punching bag." John turned to face the 3 men. His lip was still bleeding slightly, and the bruise under his eye was darkening by the minute. But his expression was serene, almost amused. "I appreciate what you're all saying," John said, "but I'm getting what I came here for." "Which is what, abuse?" Rico asked, genuinely confused. John smiled, though it clearly hurt his split lip. "Understanding. Every gym has its own culture. Every instructor has their own style. I'm learning his." The 3 students exchanged glances. They didn't understand, but there was something in John's tone that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing, even if they didn't. What none of them realized was that John had been in far worse situations than this. He'd trained with choreographers who pushed actors to their absolute limits to get the perfect take. He'd worked with fighters who didn't believe in holding back because they thought it made the stunts look more realistic. He'd been thrown through real sugar glass, had actually been hit by cars at low speeds, and had sustained injuries that required months of physical therapy. Victor's behavior was mean-spirited and unprofessional. Yes, but it wasn't actually dangerous to someone with John's experience. More importantly, John was genuinely curious about something. He wanted to understand what drove someone to treat another person this way. Was it insecurity? Was it ego? Was it just poor teaching methodology that had never been challenged? Over the next few days, Victor's confidence grew. The older student kept coming back despite everything. This proved to Victor that he'd been right all along. The guy was weak, passive, someone who would accept any treatment because he had no backbone. During the next group class that John observed from the side, Victor started using him as a regular example of what not to do. Whenever he wanted to demonstrate a technique incorrectly, he'd call John up. Whenever he wanted to show the difference between a proper fighting stance and a poor one, John was his go-to comparison. "See, this is what happens when you're too old to develop real muscle memory," Victor would say. "The body just can't adapt anymore." But hey, at least he's trying, right? Some students laughed uncomfortably. Others stayed silent. A growing number were losing respect for Victor, even though they didn't say it out loud. This wasn't the instructor they'd signed up to learn from. This was someone who seemed to be getting something personal out of humiliating another human being. But John never reacted. Never got angry. Never defended himself. He just kept showing up, kept paying for lessons, kept training with that same quiet intensity that Victor mistook for weakness. What Victor didn't know was that he was being given a gift. John was offering him chance after chance to recognize his own behavior and correct it. Every time John came back despite the mistreatment, it was an opportunity for Victor to look in the mirror and ask himself why he felt the need to treat someone this way. But Victor was too caught up in his own ego to see it. He thought he was teaching a lesson about toughness and hierarchy. He thought he was showing everyone in the gym what real martial arts looked like compared to whatever amateur experience this older guy had. He had no idea that the lesson was meant for him. And he had no idea how dramatically that lesson was about to be delivered. The moment that changed everything happened during the 4th week of training. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and the gym was moderately full with the usual after-work crowd. John arrived as he always did, exactly on time, carrying the same worn gym bag he'd brought since day 1. Victor was in an especially assertive mood that day. One of his competitive fighters had won a regional tournament over the weekend, and several people had stopped by to congratulate him on his coaching. His ego was riding high, and when John walked in with that same humble, almost invisible presence, it irritated Victor like sand in his shoe. They began the session with the usual warm-up routine. Shadowboxing, stretching, light pad work. But Victor's strikes on the counter pads were getting progressively harder. He was testing how much force he could use before John would finally say something, finally show some sign of breaking. John's forearms were already covered in bruises from 3 weeks of this treatment, layers of yellow and purple and green marking every session. But he kept his guard up and absorbed the impacts without complaint. Your defense is getting worse instead of better," Victor announced loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. 3 weeks of training and you're actually worse than when you started. Makes me wonder if you're even trying." A woman named Lisa, who'd been training at the gym for 2 years, stopped her workout and stared at Victor. She'd had enough of watching this unfold. "Victor, maybe you should focus on your own training," Victor cut her off sharply. "Unless you want to demonstrate proper technique for everyone." Lisa backed down, but her expression made it clear she was disgusted. Several other students had similar looks on their faces. The atmosphere in the gym had changed over the past month. What used to be a place of tough but respectful training had become uncomfortable, tense. People were starting to avoid the times when Victor was giving John private lessons. But Victor was oblivious to all of this. He was so focused on proving his dominance over this one student that he couldn't see how it was affecting his entire business and reputation. "Let's do some clinch work," Victor said, moving closer to John. In Muay Thai, the clinch is where two fighters grab each other and fight from close range, using knees and short strikes. It requires trust and control because it's easy to hurt someone if you're not being careful. They began the drill, and immediately Victor started using excessive force. He yanked John's head down with the neck clinch harder than necessary. When John tried to defend and reverse the position, Victor swept his leg out from under him with a forceful kick to the calf. John hit the mat hard, the impact echoing through the gym. Several students stopped what they were doing to watch. This wasn't training anymore. This was something else. Victor stood over John, hands on his hips, a smirk on his face. "Come on, old-timer, get up." "Can't give up that easy." John pushed himself to his feet slowly. There was something different in his eyes now, just for a moment. A flicker of something that made Rico, who was watching from the heavy bag area, suddenly tense up, but it disappeared as quickly as it came, and John simply reset his stance. "Ready to continue?" John asked quietly. Victor's smirk widened. The guy was either incredibly dedicated or incredibly stupid. Either way, Victor was enjoying this too much to stop now. "Let's try that again," Victor said, "and this time try to actually defend yourself." They reset in the clinch position. Victor immediately went aggressive, throwing a knee that John blocked, then attempting another sweep. But this time, John's base was stronger. He didn't go down. Victor tried again, using more force, more aggression. Then he crossed the line that couldn't be uncrossed. Victor suddenly released the clinch and, with John's hands dropping for just a split second, threw a deliberate push kick to John's chest. It wasn't a teaching technique. It wasn't a drill. It was just aggression, pure and simple. John flew backward and crashed onto the mat on his back, the air forced from his lungs with an audible gasp. The entire gym went silent. Even the sound of the heavy bag stopped swinging. Everyone was frozen, staring at what had just happened. Victor stood there, breathing hard, that same arrogant smirk on his face. "Maybe you should try yoga instead, old man. This is a real fighter's gym. Not everyone's cut out for this." For several long seconds, John just lay there on his back, staring at the ceiling. Rico started walking over, ready to help him up and maybe finally say something to Victor about his behavior. Danny, the young fighter who'd been pushed into that aggressive sparring session, looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. Then John moved. He didn't struggle or scramble. He simply rolled smoothly to his feet in one fluid motion, the kind of movement that came from thousands of hours of practice. Not the movement of someone struggling with martial arts, but the movement of someone who'd done this so many times it was as natural as breathing. John dusted himself off slowly and looked at Victor with an expression that was impossible to read. Not angry, not scared, just measuring. "One more round?" John asked, his voice completely calm. Victor, his ego now fully in control and blinding him to everything else happening around him, laughed. "Sure. Let's see if you can last 30 seconds without ending up on your back again." They reset their positions. The gym was so quiet you could hear the traffic outside on the street. Every single person had stopped training to watch this. Some part of every student there knew they were about to witness something important, even if they didn't know what. Victor came forward with the same aggressive energy, throwing a punch combination meant to overwhelm, jab cross hook, the kind of combination he'd thrown 1,000 times. The kind that had worked on countless students and opponents over his 15-year career. But this time, everything changed. John's hands moved in a blur. Not wild or panicked, but precise and controlled. He deflected the jab with a textbook parry, slipped the cross with a small head movement that required perfect timing, and caught the hook with a block that redirected all the power harmlessly past his head. Before Victor could even register what had happened, John had stepped inside his guard. Victor suddenly found himself in a position he'd never been in during all his years of teaching. He was completely vulnerable, off balance, with his opponent having perfect control of the position. John's fist stopped exactly 1 inch from Victor's jaw. Not touching, not threatening, just frozen there in perfect form. At the same time, his other hand had controlled Victor's lead arm, and his positioning made it impossible for Victor to counter or escape. It had happened so fast that Victor's brain was still catching up to what his eyes had seen. One moment he'd been in control, pressing an attack. The next moment he was completely dominated and he hadn't even seen how it happened. The gym remained absolutely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. John held the position for 3 seconds. Not moving, not pressing the advantage, just making a point that couldn't be misunderstood. Then he slowly withdrew, stepping back and dropping his hands to his sides. Victor stumbled backward, his face cycling through confusion, shock, and the beginning of realization. His hands were shaking slightly, though whether from adrenaline or fear or something else he couldn't tell. "What?" Victor started to say, but his voice came out hoarse. John said nothing. He just stood there, breathing calmly, waiting. Rico was the first to move. He pulled out his phone, his hands trembling slightly as he typed something into the search bar. His eyes went wide as he looked at the screen, then at John, then back at the screen. "Oh my God," Rico said, his voice cutting through the silence. That's Keanu Reeves." The name hit the gym like a thunderclap. Suddenly everyone was pulling out phones, searching, comparing the face of the quiet man in simple workout clothes to thousands of images online, red carpet photos, movie posters, and most significantly behind-the-scenes footage from action films. Danny found a video first. His phone speakers played the sound of training as everyone crowded around to watch. It was footage from a film set, showing the preparation for fight scenes. And there was John, moving with a level of skill that made Victor's stomach drop like a stone. In the video, he was working with world-class martial artists and stunt coordinators. His movements weren't the careful, controlled techniques of a beginner. They were the precise, devastating actions of someone who'd trained with the best in the world. Kicks that could break bones, punches that moved faster than the eye could follow, gun handling that Special Forces operators had praised for its accuracy. More videos came up, clips from action movies showing fight choreography that was widely regarded as some of the most realistic ever filmed. Interviews with professional fighters and martial artists talking about how seriously he took training. Behind-the-scenes footage showing him doing most of his own stunts, refusing doubles even for dangerous sequences. One video showed him training in Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Another showed him working on judo throws. A third showed him doing practical firearm training at a professional facility. Every video revealed the same truth. The man Victor had been mocking and pushing around for 3 weeks was someone who'd dedicated years of his life to learning actual combat skills from people who knew more than Victor ever would. Victor felt the blood drain from his face. His mouth went dry. Everything John had done suddenly made perfect sense. The careful movements weren't hesitation, they were control. The quiet acceptance wasn't weakness, it was the confidence of someone who had absolutely nothing to prove. The lack of aggression wasn't fear, it was the restraint of someone who genuinely understood what violence could do. The gym erupted in whispers and exclamations. Students were showing each other videos, sharing facts, piecing together exactly who had been training among them for nearly a month. Lisa, the woman who'd tried to speak up earlier, had tears in her eyes. Not from sadness, but from the validation that she'd been right to be disturbed by Victor's behavior. Through all of this, John just stood quietly in the center of the mat, watching Victor process the magnitude of what he'd done. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction at being revealed. If anything, he looked slightly sad, because John had been giving Victor a gift this whole time and Victor had been too blind to see it. The gift of being treated with respect and patience despite knowing nothing about the person you were dealing with. The gift of second chances. The gift of humility. And now that gift was over and the real lesson was about to begin. Victor stood frozen in the center of the mat, watching his entire gym transform around him. Students were clustered in groups, phones out, voices rising in excited disbelief as they discovered exactly who had been training among them for the past month. "Look at this one," Danny said, turning his phone so others could see. It was a compilation video of action sequences from various films, showing incredible fight choreography that had taken months of training to perfect. The stunt coordinator said he trained 8 hours a day for 4 months to prepare for this. Another student found an interview with a famous martial artist. He talks about how dedicated this guy is, says he trains harder than most professional fighters. Look, here's a quote. "He doesn't just learn the moves for the camera. He actually learns the art. Properly. With respect." Carlos discovered photos from a martial arts tournament where John had been training with active competitors, not as a celebrity, but as a serious student. There were images of him working with renowned instructors from multiple disciplines. Judo, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Krav Maga, and yes, Muay Thai from masters who'd produced actual champions. With each new discovery, Victor felt himself shrinking. His chest felt tight. His hands were still trembling, and now there was no way to hide it. The confident, dominant instructor who'd walked into this gym an hour ago was gone, replaced by someone who suddenly understood how badly he'd misjudged the situation. Rico walked up to John, his phone still in hand, showing a video of him training with a world champion kickboxer. "Man, why didn't you say something? Why did you let him? I mean, you could have..." John's expression was gentle as he interrupted. "Because it shouldn't have mattered who I was. That's the point." The simple statement cut through the noise of the gym. Several students stopped talking to listen. "You're saying Victor should have treated you with respect even if you were just a regular person starting martial arts?" Lisa asked, understanding dawning on her face. John nodded. "Everyone who walks through that door deserves to be taught with dignity. Doesn't matter if they're skilled or not, young or old, experienced or completely new. A good teacher builds people up. They don't tear them down to feel bigger." Victor felt those words like physical blows. Each one was true, and each one revealed just how far he'd fallen from the principles he'd claimed to teach. Martial arts was supposed to be about discipline, respect, and self-improvement. When had he lost sight of that? When had his ego become more important than his students' growth? Danny, the young fighter Victor had pushed into that aggressive sparring session, walked over to John with guilt written all over his face. "I'm so sorry about last week. Victor told me not to hold back, but I should have questioned it." "I should have." "You were following your instructor," John said kindly. "That's what students do. You trusted that he had good intentions." "But I hurt you," Danny said, gesturing to the faded bruise that was still visible under John's eye. John smiled slightly. "I've had worse injuries filming a 15-second scene that took 3 days to shoot. This," he touched his face gently, "this will heal. The more important question is what everyone learns from this situation." The gym had gone quiet again. Every student was now focused on the conversation happening in the center of the mat. This was the real teaching moment, and everyone could feel it. Victor finally found his voice, though it came out rough and uncertain. I need to say something." Everyone turned to look at him. Some faces showed curiosity. Others showed disappointment or anger, and a few showed something like pity. Victor had never felt so exposed in his entire life. "I owe you an apology," Victor said, looking directly at John. There's no excuse for how I treated you. I was wrong. Why did you do it?" John asked. Not accusingly, but genuinely curious. "What was it about me that made you feel the need to treat me that way?" The question hung in the air. Victor had been asking himself the same thing since the moment his world had turned upside down 5 minutes ago. Why had he targeted this quiet, polite student? Why had he felt such a strong need to prove his dominance? "I don't know," Victor admitted, then corrected himself. "No, that's not true. I think I saw someone I perceived as weak, and it made me feel powerful to push them around." The honesty of the statement shocked everyone, including Victor himself. He'd never admitted something like that out loud before. He'd always justified his tough teaching style as necessary, as building character, as preparing students for reality. But stripped of all those justifications, the ugly truth remained. "You know what the saddest part is?" Lisa spoke up, her voice shaking slightly. "We all saw it happening. Everyone in this gym watched you treat him terribly for weeks, and most of us said nothing." Several students looked down at their feet, shame coloring their faces. She was right. They'd all witnessed the mistreatment and convinced themselves it wasn't their place to intervene. They'd told themselves that Victor knew what he was doing, that it must be some kind of teaching technique they didn't understand. "That's not on you," John said firmly. "Power dynamics are complicated. Speaking up against an authority figure, especially when you're the one paying them for instruction, requires a lot of courage. The responsibility here belongs to Victor, not to any of you." Rico shook his head. "But we could have done something." "We should have." "And what would you have done?" John asked. "Really think about it. If I had been just a regular person starting martial arts with no secret identity or special training, what would you have done?" The question made everyone pause. It was easy to feel guilty now, knowing that the person being mistreated was someone famous, someone skilled, someone who could have defended themselves at any time. But what about all the people who couldn't defend themselves? What about future students who might walk through that door? Carlos raised his hand slightly like he was in school. "I think that's the real lesson here. It's not about who you were. It's about the fact that no one should be treated like that regardless of who they are." John pointed at him and nodded. Exactly. Victor was struggling to process everything happening around him. His gym, his students, his entire understanding of himself as a teacher and martial artist was being dismantled piece by piece. And the worst part was that he deserved it. He'd built this situation brick by brick through his own actions. "I've been teaching for 16 years, Victor said quietly. "I thought I was tough but fair. I thought I was preparing people for the reality of fighting. But somewhere along the way I started enjoying the power more than the teaching. I started caring more about feeling superior than actually helping people improve." The admission was painful to hear because it was so clearly true. Several longtime students exchanged glances, recognizing that they'd seen signs of this shift over the years but had rationalized it away. "So what happens now?" Danny asked, looking between Victor and John. Victor expected John to quit, to leave the gym and maybe post about his experience online, destroying the reputation Victor had spent years building. It would be justified. It would be fair. Victor had earned that consequence through his own behavior, but John surprised him again. "That depends on Victor," John said. "This can be a moment where everything falls apart, or it can be a moment where everything changes for the better. The choice is his." Victor looked at John with genuine confusion. "You're saying you'd continue training here? After everything?" "I'm saying this gym has good people in it." John gestured around at the students. "I've watched them train for weeks. They work hard. They support each other. They have potential. But they need a teacher who brings out the best in them, not someone who needs to prove he's the toughest person in the room." The challenge in those words was clear, but it wasn't a challenge to fight. It was a challenge to grow, to change, to become better. Victor felt something crack inside him, some wall of ego and defensiveness that he'd been building for years. "I don't know if I can do that," Victor said honestly. "I don't know if I know how to teach without being like I've been." "Then learn," John said simply. "The same way you'd teach a student who came in knowing nothing. Start with the basics. Respect, patience, humility. Build from there." Lisa wiped her eyes and spoke up. "I've been thinking about leaving this gym for a while now. The atmosphere has gotten uncomfortable. But if things actually change, if Victor actually commits to being better, I'd stay." "I think a lot of us would." Several students nodded in agreement. They wanted to believe change was possible. They wanted to be part of a gym they could be proud of again. Victor looked around at all the faces watching him. Some were hopeful. Some were skeptical. All of them were waiting to see what he would do with this moment. "I'll do it," Victor said. "I'll change. Not just because I got caught. Not just because of who you are, but because I need to. For myself and for everyone who trusts me to teach them." John extended his hand. "Then I'll keep training here. And I'll do it as John, not as anyone famous. Just another student trying to learn." Victor shook his hand, feeling the weight of the commitment he'd just made. This wasn't going to be easy. Changing deep patterns of behavior never was. But for the first time in years, Victor felt like he was on the right path. The gym slowly came back to life. Students returned to their training, but something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere. There was a sense of possibility now, a feeling that this place could become what it was always supposed to be. As Victor watched John warm up for continuing their session as if nothing had happened, he realized something profound. The greatest martial artist he'd ever encountered wasn't great because of his physical skills. He was great because he understood that real strength came from character, not technique. Real power came from lifting others up, not tearing them down. It was a lesson Victor would spend the rest of his teaching career trying to live up to. And it had come from the most unlikely source. A humble student he'd almost driven away through his own arrogance. The following weeks at the gym were unlike anything Victor had experienced in his 16 years of teaching. The change wasn't immediate or magical. There was no single moment where everything became perfect. Instead, it was a slow, sometimes painful process of unlearning bad habits and rebuilding from the ground up. The first real test came the very next day after the revelation. Victor arrived at the gym early, as he always did, but this time he spent an hour just sitting in the empty space, thinking about how he'd been teaching and how he needed to change. When students started arriving for the morning class, he gathered everyone together before training began. "I need to talk to you all," Victor said, his voice steady but humble. "About yesterday, about how I've been running this gym, and about what's going to change." The 15 students in the morning class looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Word had spread quickly through the gym's community about what had happened. Even people who hadn't been there knew the story by now. For those who weren't there yesterday, I treated a student terribly for weeks. I was condescending, aggressive, and disrespectful. And when I was called out on it, I realized that it wasn't just about that one person. I've been letting my ego control my teaching for longer than I want to admit. He paused, looking around at faces he'd known for years. Some of these students had been with him since he'd opened the gym. Others were relatively new. All of them deserved better than what he'd been giving them. I'm going to work on being better. Not perfect because I'm going to mess up along the way, but genuinely better. And I need you all to hold me accountable. If you see me slipping back into old patterns, call me out on it. I'm not just your instructor anymore. I'm a student too, learning how to teach the right way. The speech wasn't elegant or polished, but it was honest. That's what mattered. After a moment of silence, a student named Teresa raised her hand. "What made you realize you needed to change?" she asked. Victor thought about that question carefully. Someone showed me more grace than I deserved. They could have humiliated me, could have destroyed my reputation, could have just walked away and let me keep being who I was. Instead, they gave me a chance to be better. And I realized that if I didn't take that chance, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. Training that morning was different. Victor found himself catching old impulses before they turned into actions. When he wanted to make a sarcastic comment about someone's technique, he paused and found a constructive way to give the same feedback. When he felt the urge to show off, he redirected that energy into genuine teaching. It was exhausting in a way that physical training never was. Changing yourself required constant vigilance and honesty, but it was also oddly freeing. Victor realized how much energy he'd been wasting on maintaining his image of superiority. When John came in for his scheduled afternoon session, the other students who were present immediately noticed the change. Victor greeted him with genuine respect, asking how he felt after yesterday's intensity and if there were any lingering aches from the fall. "I'm good," John said with his characteristic calm smile, ready to continue learning. They worked on technique that day, actual technique, with Victor teaching the way he'd been taught when he was a young fighter training in Thailand decades ago. He showed John the subtle details of weight transfer and strikes, the importance of breath control, the mental aspects of maintaining composure under pressure. For the first time since John had started training there, Victor was actually teaching him something valuable. And John, despite clearly knowing much of it already, absorbed every word with genuine interest and asked thoughtful questions that showed he was always looking to deepen his understanding. Rico, who was working the heavy bag nearby, watched the interaction with satisfaction. This was what the gym was supposed to be like. This was worth staying for. Over the following weeks, the transformation became more visible. Victor started personally apologizing to students he'd been harsh with in the past. Some accepted immediately. Others needed time. A few had been hurt too deeply and decided to train elsewhere, which Victor accepted without trying to convince them to stay. "I understand," he told one woman who'd been on the receiving end of particularly cutting comments about her weight during training. "I said things I can never take back, and I don't blame you for not wanting to be around me. I just want you to know that I'm sorry and I'm working on being better." The woman nodded, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for saying that. It actually helps to hear it." Even though she didn't come back to the gym, that conversation mattered. It was part of Victor's process of taking responsibility for his actions and their consequences. The gym's atmosphere began to change in noticeable ways. Students who had been tense and cautious started relaxing. People laughed more during training. New students were welcomed warmly and given patient instruction regardless of their skill level or physical condition. Danny, the young fighter who'd been pushed into aggressive sparring with John, came to Victor one afternoon with a confession. "I've been training here for 3 years," Danny said, "and I think I've been copying your old attitude. I've been looking down on newer students thinking I was better than them because I could hit harder or move faster. Watching you change made me realize I was doing the same thing you were doing." Victor felt a pang in his chest. His bad example had spread beyond just his own actions. "What are you going to do about it?" "Same thing you're doing," Danny said. "Change. I apologized to some people already. It felt weird but good." "Yeah," Victor agreed. "It does feel that way." The relationship between Victor and John evolved into something neither of them had expected. It became a genuine teacher-student dynamic, but with the roles sometimes reversed. Victor taught John the specific techniques and cultural elements of Muay Thai, as practiced in Thailand. John shared insights from his years of training with various masters, offering perspectives that enriched Victor's own understanding. One day, about 6 weeks after the revelation, they were working on clinch techniques when Victor stopped mid-demonstration. "Can I ask you something?" Victor said, "Of course. Why did you really come here?" "I mean, you've trained with world champions. You've worked with the best martial artists on the planet. Why walk into a random gym in LA and train with someone like me?" John thought about the question for a moment. "Because every teacher has something unique to offer if you're humble enough to learn from them. You have 15 years of experience running this gym, teaching hundreds of students. That's valuable knowledge, even if it got buried under ego for a while. Plus," he smiled slightly, "I wasn't lying when I said I heard good things about this place. Several people told me you used to be an excellent instructor before something changed." "What changed was, I stopped seeing students as people and started seeing them as reflections of my own success or failure," Victor said quietly. "When they did well, it meant I was a good teacher. When they struggled, it meant they weren't worthy of my time. That's backwards. But you're unlearning it," John pointed out. "That's what matters." The gym's reputation began to shift in the martial arts community. Word spread about what had happened, and surprisingly, it didn't destroy Victor's business. Instead, it brought in a different kind of student. People who'd been afraid to try martial arts because they worried about being judged or humiliated started showing up. They'd heard that this was a place where someone famous had trained anonymously and been treated poorly, then chose to stay and help the instructor become better.